Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the CannAtlantic Conference, the country's first Mid-Atlantic cannabis conference, brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this session is all about organizing and mobilizing, led by Chelsea Higgs Wise, the co-founder of Marijuana Justice down in Richmond, Virginia. You've learned a whole lot today. You've gone through all the State of the State presentations. You've listened to a bunch of amazing sessions from growing your business to the intersection of the cannabis movement and the abolish police movement to what is going on in the drug policy world after legalization. Now, what do you do with all this information? You want to act, you want to get involved, you want to participate in advocacy or become an activist or even just become a better ally. How do you get involved? Chelsea is going to walk you through some of these tactics, some of the strategies, and just some pointers so that you can feel more involved and that you can feel like you are participating and supporting the movement. So without further ado, I'm really excited to have Chelsea here to talk with us about organizing and mobilizing. Chelsea, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Again, my name is Chelsea Higgs Wise. I am the co-founder of Marijuana Justice. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about organizing and mobilizing. Marijuana Justice is a young organization, but we are a collective of longtime organizers dedicated to racial justice here, particularly in Virginia and the South. And we see this platform as using organizing our tactics and our strengths and talents to really mobilizing for a new type of cannabis enforcement and reinvestment for our entire Commonwealth. So that's what I'm really excited to talk about today. Organizing, especially this year in 2020, and the uprisings, the revolution that we are still feeling has really been something that's been deep in my heart in order to really sharpen these skills, talk to other advocates across the country about what types of skills they are practicing right now, what else are they learning when it comes to organizing and mobilizing. When talking about mobilizing and organizing, I first really encourage people to really stop and ask themselves, what is your privilege? When we're organizing in marijuana and cannabis, we have to understand that the people that are the most impacted are still behind the jails and prisons. They're locked into cages. And that means that we have a real access, that we have a privilege. If you're able to access this conference, you're at a privilege with a type of internet access that a lot of our comrades and siblings within the jail system and the prison system do not have access to. So continuing to understand that Wi-Fi, Google, being able to call, write a letter without paying for a stamp from the JPay, that is all a privilege. And that means that we are positioned to be liaisons between the impacted community and those with the perceived power and authority to really make sure that we are moving forward to set our people free. That means that we are the liaison between the stories and the solutions that are coming from those impacted to get that to the right people that are supposed to be legislating and making decisions for our best interest. So before we even get started, I'd just really like to say for people, really make sure that we know your own privilege, right? Like ask your comrades, talk to your other people, like ask this question in your regular day-to-day life, like what is my privilege? Because what you'll start to see is the collateral consequences that have come from the war on drugs impact us in ways that we've never have seen before. And it also shows what has been taken away from our people that are the most impacted and are locked away or been disenfranchised in other ways that we just never imagined. So that type of awareness and consciousness, the internal and personal consciousness will be able to bring us as better advocates forward to talk about why we are still being impacted, disenfranchised, and disinvested in many different ways. So let's just jump right on in to organizing and mobilizing. First off, I'd like to remind people that organizing and mobilizing is different. They go hand in hand, but they are different and different talents, different skills. That means different people are going to be seen taking leadership roles in different spaces. Even if you have the same team, like I have for many years, because we've been small before the revolution got going, right? Even if you have the same team, the mobilizing crew they may be doing very different things than the organizing crew because we have different skill sets. So understanding that mobilizing and organizing gives people opportunities to step up in leadership, decision-making spaces. And that's what's so great about using mobilizing and organizing as a liberated tactic to engage our community, right? So just remembering that they are different. Many people see the mobilization impact, right? They see us out in the streets, the action specifically, and they think and can conflate that to organizing. But remember, the organizing is what happens, that usually what you do not see in the public or the press. So let's break down organizing. I have 5 different points for organizing, and I'm going to go through them and just kind of talk a little bit about what are the things that you need to think about when organizing in your place, space, and your time. After learning everything that we've talked about today, there's now an idea of how do I apply that to my community and my place, like literally where you are. I am in Richmond, Virginia, the fallen capital of the Confederacy. We're in the South. My space right now is actually my bedroom. I'm a mom and my daughter's downstairs doing her virtual school. But my space too is my advocacy space, my community spaces that I'm in, my social spaces that I'm in, right now, my COVID virtual spaces that I'm in. So organizing in your place, space, and time. And of course, this time is so important. And we're seeing that the time of 2020 means that there's a lot of opportunity. So number one, the first one is to identify the vision that you all want brought to life by mobilizing. So what's the vision? A lot of people say, well, what's our goal? What's our problem? I like to say the vision because I know a lot of folks today have been talking about the dream, like dreaming up the world that we want to live in, a liberated world. So putting that first, it really does bring a balance and a grounding to when you are in the midst of complication and legislators and other advocates are making you feel confused and crazy. If you have a grounded vision of what you are fighting for, what the world looks like and how it's different, right? With a just cannabis legalization and laws and just community building around this, right? Mobilizing and organizing isn't just about the legislative part. It's about what it does and what it really comes about in your community. So vision what you want to bring to life. Number 2 is bring what's in the dark to light, right? This is now our research point, our research infrastructure. I'm going to talk about the word infrastructure a lot because I want to remind everyone that organizing is a long-term sustainable movement, right? So when we're building infrastructure, we want it to last, not just a rapid response. So number 2 is bring what's in the dark to light. This is our research, right? So now this is about collecting the data of your place and space. Number 1, I love to disrupt the idea of data, right? And as marijuana advocates, we must do that as well. The decision makers, the ones with perceived power, often say that they need data, right? The data that they're talking about is the data produced by the state. They're not valuing the data that has taught us the liberated tactics for generations, right? Those are normally the data of our stories, our oral histories that's passed down. That is data. So as advocates, we are going to be connecting that data that we know to feed us, to really teach us, and pair that to the state issued data, right? That is now what your data looks like on enforcement in cannabis, as well as bring up the impacts of the structural poverty that's been created in your place, right? So what does that look like? That means organizing the data around redlining in your community, around evictions in your community, education, food security, whatever it is in your area. Here in Virginia, we are number 2 in the nation in Richmond, where I live, for evictions, number 2. So when we're talking about the data that we need to show the impact of the war on drugs, we're gathering that data, right? As well as the stories of triumph. That means archives and press, right? Like bring up the stories of when marijuana, war on drugs has truly brought violence on a community. Bring that up. And finally, look at the images for your data and your research. Many times our stories are told through the images of struggle. What we know to be true through the war on drugs, that our folks have been fighting for liberation and resistance for years. And so finding photographs in the archives of our resistance, of saying, we've been doing this for generations. We've been telling you what the solutions are. We've been telling you that locking us up is not the issue. We've been telling you that the war on drugs is just to criminalize our bodies for profit within this system after emancipation, right? Show those images, show the power. All right. Number 3 is now organize your engagement, right? Now that you've got your data, now that you know a little bit about how this very structural war on drugs has impacted your place in space and throughout the time, right now, organize your engagement infrastructure. So number 1, when you're talking to your community, your impacted community, our brothers, sisters, and comrades inside the jails, look at the most impacted people outside and how are you going to, on the inside, and how are you going to engage them? What's the infrastructure that you're building to engage with them, right? Putting one person on emailing back and forth, that might not be sustainable. So build up your engagement infrastructure. Connect with those in the community, not just with those inside, right? Work with their community, work with their family, reach out to the lawyers, the justice lawyers, the press that's written on them. When you're looking up their names, looking at war on drugs, don't just take it at press journalist values. Look up their names and reach out to them, get their own stories, figure out what your infrastructure is to gathering, right, your engagement. And that's what's the really important part, is that many of our narratives that's out there takes us to really reframe and translate to now be the engagement that will invite the people that have been most impacted and not push them out and feel like they're going to be another criminal. And finally, the last part about organizing your engagement and your infrastructure is about understanding your targets. So I put this in understanding your engagement infrastructure about your targets, is because we need to understand how the different tactics and diversity of tactics of engaging our targets. Of course, at first, you have to understand who your targets are. Those are normally the people that hold decision-making power, right? You have your community to build the collective, and you're going to point them to the target of those that need to shift. So organizing that infrastructure of how you are maintaining an ongoing engagement with your targets. Number 4 is build up your group and your demand around a democratic leadership. Now, that's a little D, not a big D. We're not talking about political parties here. So we want you to build up your democratic leadership. Right? Now, why is there a democratic leadership? Because we have to prepare your advocacy to go on for a long time, the sustainable infrastructure. And when it shifts, we understand they will respond to our resistance and coming with an equitable reinvestment model. So when that comes, that resistance to our liberation, we will be ready to say, now we have to take some accountability. And by doing that in a democratic process, the power will always still be within our hands. Do not allow for the power and the decision-making in the group's future to fall into corporate models, right? To fall into the business owners being the ones that are required equity. Building up a model as you are writing this legislation, as you are advocating for whatever the programs are, to make sure in the future that you have a democratic process to oversee and shift them for when it comes back around, when they try and disinvest in these programs, y'all. So number 5, and then before I move to number 4, remember that democratic process is our at the ballot. It's around our justice organizations for folks that have been stripped away with that right to the ballot, right? And that way, we know exactly who we can target and holding them accountable with our voices. And number 5, how are you staying true to your liberated practices? Right? Number 5, really solidify your liberated practices in your organizing. Okay. We have to understand that organizing around cannabis, and it is actually Black Cannabis Week. So when we're thinking about this, we have to understand that we have not seen organizing happen for cannabis in the United States that truly benefits us the way that we deserve after the type of impacts that enforcement has had on many communities of color, specifically Black communities that we have the data on. So we have to understand, like, what are your liberated practices? What is the foundation? What are the systems that you're going to create to evolve your legislation and teach new people, new organizers, how to come at this with a practice and not just a reform mindset, right? So in organizing, we have to always, we started out with really the vision, and now we're going to kind of wrap up this organizing part is revisiting our liberated practices. All right. So let's move on to mobilization. Mobilization, we've got 5 parts as well. I like the repetition, 5 on 5. All right, so next up is mobilization. Number 1 is we need to identify our audience and the tools to engage, right? So many times we find our audience actually through the tools, the processes, right? So whether you're Googling the organizations that work in justice realms, right? So folks that are fighting for civil rights, folks that are fighting for releasing and decarceration, these are the folks to go ahead and identify within your state. So identify your audience and the tools of how you're finding them and how you are sustaining communication with them, right? It goes back to your infrastructure. So identifying your audience and your tools. Because I also want to say too, this part of the mobilization, this should not be your first touch with your audience, right? They should have heard from you before. They might even be learning from you a little bit, but now in this mobilization time, you're asking them to engage and do something, right? We're about to get them to act. So you don't want your very first touch with your audience to be when you're ready to ask them for something. So again, remembering the tools of organizing. Number 2, identifying diversity of tactics, identifying your friction with tactics. Now that you are mobilizing, we are out in the community more. We are building coalitions, whether they are formal or informal, right? So now we have to identify and be really transparent with one another that we are mobilizing with. What are our tactics? What do we feel comfortable with? And how are we going to manage the friction as we organize? To deny or to erase or to push back the idea that there will be friction is to not understand the histories that our ancestors have taught us. There will be friction. Okay, so talk about that and be open about number 2, identifying diversity of tactics and the friction that can come out about that. I really want to invite people to look at the transparent conflict resolution, restorative justice practices that come from a community mindset, an African rooted set, not things that you see in the fake criminal justice system. Ones where we are also not throwing away our comrades because of friction, right? We understand what our collective pressure means and how we treat ourselves differently than we treat the oppressor that we are targeting. So in doing that, number 2 step will help a lot of that when it comes up. Number 3 is sustaining your organizing. Sustaining your mobilizing. Infrastructure to maintain your communication with your mobilizing. Here in a digital world, especially in 2020 when we've gone COVID, understanding that now we have to build our infrastructure, write the policies, write the skills share with one another of how we are creating an infrastructure, y'all. Finding one person that can do your social media is not a sustainable mobilizing tactic. Think through how you're going to do that. Think through how you're going to reach people in the streets. Are you knocking doors? How often, right? Build that into your infrastructure, into your calendar, right? When you're doing your year-long plan, how are you sustaining this? I'm noticing, and something I've worked with even with myself as organizers, specifically Black organizers, specifically Black femme organizers, when we take on so much for our community in this particular fight of over policing and the war on drugs, is that we're doing so much in an unsustainable way, but still making progress, right? We're doing the work, but building this to sustain. Inviting feedback, utilizing the feedback, y'all, because since we cannot do it by ourselves and we're building this to sustain, we have to be able to hear others' ideas and invite them in to be able to lead and show us different ways, right? So sustaining that movement means inviting people in and really skill sharing to a lateral type of governments that's a community-led piece. All right, number 4, let's talk more about identifying the target in your mobilizing. All right. So normally in cannabis enforcement, cannabis mobilizing, war on drugs, justice organizing, we're looking at number 1, your place and space of your local elected officials as well, right? I know most of this is state level, state legislators, but do not let your local officials step away from what their responsibility is. Most of the collateral consequences that are felt from the war on drugs are through our local officials' oversight. So identifying who they are, where those lines and boundaries are, and exactly what their powers are, right? And that means who's their second in charge, right? Who is the person that the Commonwealth Attorney is going to always send out? Who's that community engagement person that the mayor is going to always send out instead of coming outside to talk to you? So identifying these targets and how you want to mobilize around them, right? And once you know who they are and what their powers are, that's when you start talking to your coalition members about what it looks like to mobilize around them. It doesn't always have to, when we say targets, a lot of people get really defensive, right? But let's look at the levels of escalation. Once you find out who they are and what their powers are, decide not just the one piece of escalation, like where you want to escalate and how high, but write out a few different ways. Like, what's your very first entryway to target? And then as you escalate, what does that look like? Figure out what your audience and your, coalition members will be consuming, especially in the media, as you escalate your targets and you escalate your mobilizing. It could be anything from just taking 5 meetings with someone that's, and doing it very civilly. And you can move up to doing a rally that's escalating. And then you could even escalate to anything that we've seen over the summer, which is showing up at elected officials' houses, which is something that we've been doing for generations as a very rational and effective target. But plan that out first. Once you identify that way you can have a really conscious thought about, if you do show up at someone's house or you only take private backdoor meetings, what is that going to look like for your audience that's consuming that information, whether that's over the media or your social media, right? So plan that out first, not just rapid response. And finally, the last one is your logistics of your mobilization, because now you are front facing in your community. So number 5 is building the infrastructure of your logistics of mobilizing. This is when you find those party planners, those event planners that are also passionate about justice, and get them involved, right? These are probably not going to be your researchers that helped you out in organizing. Lift the people with different skills. And that's really the great thing about mobilizing with organizing, is that so many people get to really bring in what their gifts are to this movement to set all of us free. So looking about your tactics, plan your actions, go through your routes, and do it in the sense of safety, right? As we talk about divesting and investing, all of this is about public safety. It's about how we keep each other safe. And so when you are mobilizing, do it in a way that's keeping you safe with Corona, COVID, but also keeping us safe from police violence, state violence, keeping us safe from sometimes even like peace policing with other constituents that think they're doing something right by policing our voices. So plan out your logistics to keep you safe. All right. Those are the 5 pieces of organizing, 5 pieces of mobilization that I really give to folks as they are building in their place, space, and time. Before I get out of here with this first intro section, I'd also really love to talk very quickly about what marijuana justice is doing to organize and mobilize in the South. And in the South, because we are liberating people that in this place space have been disenfranchised since the birth of this nation, right? We are taking real care in the way that we are organizing, mobilizing, as well as with the language of our mobilizing and what's front facing forward. So we look at our organizing Black cannabis in the South as our 3R program, which is repeal, repair, and reparations. So at Marijuana Justice, we're looking at repealing. That's repealing the prohibition, y'all. So where I'm talking about this at a state level, of course, on the national, federal level, we've heard a lot of resources and things to hear more about, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But right now, I'm talking about repealing the prohibition that is at your state level. Many states, including Virginia, we did that with possession first, right? So repealing the prohibition and understanding that true decrim is removing the code on that possession, not more fines and fees. Right. We want to organize the impacts of cannabis and their enforcement, that data, the stories that we talked about before. If you're looking for data to help start you off and look at what types of things they're collecting, I would like to lift the Drug Policy Alliance, their newest report that has talked about marijuana. It came out in 2018, as well as their decrim report. ACLU, the national org, has also put out two really great reports, one in 2018 on the world of black and white, and one that just came out this past April that's called The Tale of Two Countries, and it goes through state by state. So that is another great resource. Shout out to ACLU Virginia. They've been a great help down here. Also, and when talking about repealing, we do a lot of things at once. We have to multitask. So the repeal, repair, reparations for us has had to happen all at the same time. We work on many things all at once in order to free our people. So that also means that we are writing a bill that talks about the impacts of the prohibition on cannabis. So going back to that infrastructure of poverty that's been created, looking at that and writing a bill that will then bring about data from your state. All right, people are like, Chels, why do you need a study? Why do you want us to write a bill about a study? We should know all this. We have the data. Many legislators, specifically in the South, don't want any data that's not from them. So jump on that head early. If your state has not yet legalized, write the data bill, the study bill yourself to find out what information you want to come from there so that you can utilize that within the General Assembly, within your state legislature, to say this is the data that you provided and you can't turn away. But it's important for you to work with that. And just lastly, with the repeal part, I'm here to just say that medical marijuana, only legalizing medical marijuana, is just not something that is looking to repeal anything. Number two is repair. Really quickly, to repair, we need to go over clemency for folks. We need to resentence people, right? And we need to expunge all records of cannabis-related issues. I don't really go say all substance-related issues, decrim all drugs, but remembering that expunge means just that, to expunge it. In Virginia, what they did is they have actually created a whole new reporting system. So as we decriminalized with fines and fees on July 1, they also create a new reporting form to say, hey, your landlord won't be able to see your past drug offenses, marijuana offenses. Your university, if you apply to school, they won't be able to see it. Other people that apply, they might not be able to see it either. But you know who still will be able to see it in Virginia because of this new reporting system? The cops. So when you're talking about expungement, look at the way that your state is doing this, right? So clemency, resentencing, expungement, and the collateral consequences that I'll go through really quickly, that you can bring limits to those collateral consequences through eliminating drug tests, expunging criminal records, prohibiting employment discrimination through these drug tests and past criminal records, protecting your voting rights, repeal civil asset forfeiture, right? When they're taking our possessions and making money off of that. Repeal land prohibitions when it says no cannabis use in this land right here. Throw all that away. Provide evidence-based drug education, which also includes how we as people got criminalized through drug enforcement. Don't forget that part of the education. Don't just teach them about what drugs are or substances are and how a lot of it is medication with cannabis specifically, but don't forget about the drug education to teach them about our historical criminalization, right? And then finally, divest from the police, invest in communities. Especially Drug Policy Alliance tells us, even in states that have legalized, decriminalized, the racial inequities are still on and popping, y'all. It's still on and popping. Finally, the last R after repeal, repair, and again, these are happening simultaneously as we always have to do, is the reparations. Reparations, we need to say this now, say it loud in 2020. This is the time to say it's time to reinvest after this harm. Do not legalize without reinvestment in writing. We are chasing behind. There has been no state that has instituted this the right way. So if you are still working on legalization, do not hand over that legalization legislation without our coins in writing. Ensure new legal markets are accessible to and the most impacted. We know that, y'all. We've been hearing about that all day. Make sure the revenue most benefits the communities. Get creative. Our communities need grocery stores. Why can't the revenue of cannabis pay for that? In Virginia, 5 out of the top 10 cities here are the worst for evictions. We are been so disinvested with the war on drugs. Yeah, we need something to help our mental health, but we need shelter. Get that money to pay for that. They're about to make billions. Put it in writing. Reinvest that. Figure out what your community needs. Follow the money, y'all. Get your percentage, get your number, put it in writing, put in your demands, and then follow the money even after legislation is done. Who on your team understands investments? Who understands growth? Who can talk about this as we grow on, about how much money we're making and what's not being trickled down to us? So just remembering the repeal, repair, and reparations. I'm really excited to be here and be in community with you all. Please continue to follow us at Marijuana Justice. That's THC Justice Now on all social media platforms, or marijuanajustice.org. My name is Chelsea Higgs Wise, and thank you so much. I'm looking forward to taking some questions.